To start off, chapter 1 of the book by Dorothy Rushdoony, The Root of Inflation. Chapter 1, The Meaning of Inflation. The meaning of inflation. In chapter 1, it talked about the meaning of inflation. In this chapter, it talks about how inflation is larceny. It also talks about how they cheapen the value of money to rob creditors and reward debtors. Later in the chapter, it talks about how it is indeed a kind of conspiracy and that it could not work until the larceny state, and every inflationary state is a larcenous state. A larceny state prefers larcenous people. It also asks if we should be surprised that the larceny state is tender in its regard for the rights of a criminal, but not for the law-abiding nations. Moving on to chapter 2, which is regulations. It talks about, first, it is held that all life outside the state and its controlling government is unregulated life. And then later on, he talks about how this, of course, leads to the second myth that the non-state regulated life is a lawless life. Law is thus assumed to be exclusively an act of state. And then later on in the chapter, it talks about how these three myths lead forth to a significant fact: status, legislation, and controls lessen the regulation of a society instead of enhancing it. At this point, it is necessary to introduce a very real distinction which we have previously disregarded, in order to lay a broader foundation in terms of common usage. There is a very real difference between regulations and controls. Standard, norm, or law, regular, ruler, or rule, carries into the word regulation the concept of a norm, yardstick, or law of part of a man and the state. In chapter 3, it talks about rationing. It talks about how we should consider a few facts concerning the Garden of Eden. It was indeed an enclosed area containing all manner of fruits, vegetables, animals, birds, and the like, but it posed certain obvious problems. First of all, Adam faced Eden with no tools, nor capital other than his own mind and body. Later on, it talks about how when that still active salesman temper stopped by to promise a no-work world, naturally Eve was interested, and so too was Adam. Capitalization and progress in God's world required work and thinking, very hard work and heavy thinking. Later on in the chapter, it talks about how when the state seeks to ration goods, it controls the market. It affects or controls prices and also wages. The result is the shortages. Eggs or milk or for all sounds fine, but until the state, like Christ, can multiply loaves and fishes, create out of nothing, it destroys price and therefore production by its intervention. in chapter 4 talks about it talks about in this chapter the economics of Satan. In this chapter, he talks about this righteous, purveyor of light and goodness was on hand and pivotal moment of history when Jesus Christ was in the wilderness. Later on in the chapter, it talks about first. It should be noted that in the Greek text, Satan actually said, "If thou be a son of God." His inference was that Jesus was one son among many, all men and angels being supposedly sons of God. Second, the temptation was command that these stones be made bread. Calling attention to the rocky wilderness and to the world hunger, Satan demanded a solution to that hunger. Later on in this chapter, he talks about the temptation command that these stones be made bread is demand that be allowed to remain as he is and to evade work, freedom, and responsibility, and to have his environment or world transformed to please him. In the ending, it talks about when economics becomes a branch of politics, it ceases to be economics and becomes messianic. It becomes an instrument of power whereby men play God and plan to use human beings as their raw material for creating an imaginary world, an imaginary man.